Story 1. A theme park actor stole my plushie in a haunted house attraction. I shouldn't have tried to get it back. This year, we spent Halloween at a theme park not too far away from where we live. Come October, the park always gets turned into this amazingly sinister ghost town. All the whimsical, colorful decorations are taken down and replaced with spooky ones. Cobwebs, skeletons, body parts, tombstones, what have you. The ride controllers and operators wear zombie makeup and their uniforms are torn and smeared with fake blood. They'll also give you little jump scares occasionally when they're checking your seat's lap bars. All the eateries are selling creepy food and drinks, cupcakes with grimaces painted on the icing, chocolate-coated grapes made to look like eyeballs, and the like. I was actually amazed by just how creative and well done everything was. My favorite part, though, my favorite part by far, were the actors patrolling the streets. They came out when it got dark, all marching up the main street in an unearthly parade to the tact of beating drums, accompanied by eerie, distant sirens. Their costumes and masks were way more thought out than those of the other employees. Their makeup was obviously professionally done and looked downright horrifying. No two monsters were alike, and they all had their own personality, uniquely tailored to the roles they embodied. There had to be over 40 of them. They walked around the park seemingly at random, but I figured they all had certain routes to adhere to. They'd push through the crowds, taking their chance to either suddenly appear behind or in front of you without warning. The ones who brandished weapons would suddenly raise them or swing them at you, stopping just before actually making contact. Some would creep up on you while you were waiting in line for something, others boldly carved their way through the masses, glowering and baring their teeth as they forced people to step aside. Of course, they'd sometimes stop for a picture if you dared to come up to them and ask nicely, but they'd never break character. Despite knowing they couldn't hurt me, my heart would be sent racing whenever one of them worked their magic on me. Which happened a lot. I was found fodder for the actors. I'm a huge horror nut, but I won't pretend I don't scare easily. I screamed, whimpered, or yelped at every trick that was played on me. Just about every monster in the park managed to get me to jump at least once during my stay, and I won't pretend I didn't like it. The way my heart skipped a beat each time, the way my knees would give out for a split second and my voice ceased to obey me, my lips releasing a small cry before I could stop myself. I don't get that kind of a thrill from scary video games and movies anymore. I think my favorite monster was the guy with the bloodied face and the black leather duster and cowboy hat. He carried an axe, not a hatchet, a whole axe, which he at times raised high over the heads of visitors standing close enough or took swings with, causing those around him to quickly step back. He lifted his head to me when I got out of his way as he marched on by me. I simply appreciated the attention to detail there, even though he wasn't exceptionally gross or scary. He had also been the one beating the bass drum at the monster parade. The whole time, I was walking hand in hand with my boyfriend. We had already gotten separated in the crowd during the day and I'd nearly pissed my pants, so now that it was dark and the actors were out and about, the prospect was even more harrowing, especially since he had both of our phones in his backpack. That left us with no easy way of finding each other again. Why didn't I have my phone on me, you ask? Well, I was being stupid that morning and put on clothes without any pockets. Either way, Conrad, that's the name of said boyfriend, and I had arrived at the park in the early noon, and from the beginning, I hadn't been able to take my eyes off a plushie I'd seen at one of those carnival game stands. It was a huge round pug with big, pleading eyes. I didn't intend to show Connie how much I loved it. After all, I'm a sensible, economically thinking adult woman who likes grown-up stuff. To my surprise though, he ended up pulling me over to the stand in question. There, he whipped out his wallet and announced that he'd play until he got the pug. He did, after a while, and when he handed it to me my cheeks were beet red. There's nothing hotter than when somebody just gets that your little heart is secretly set on something, is there? So you see, my emotional attachment to this stuffed animal not only hailed from its cuteness, but also from the fact that Connie had won it for me. His act of kindness simply made it feel thrice as great. And that's how we continued our tour, carrying between us the oversized plushie. I was so goddamn happy. That was until we entered the maze. there are several uniquely themed horror mazes around the park this time of year. The one Connie and I chose was a rather classical haunted house type of attraction. Lost Hope Manor, they called it. The name was painted on the arch above the doorway in white, squiggly letters. Again, I was astounded by the creativity put into the setup. There was a whole backstory to the mansion which was relayed to us by disjointed bits of text smeared in fake blood on the walls in the waiting rooms. It was a little hard to read, but definitely fitting and very immersive, not to mention that it helped kill some time. No one has ever survived their stay at Lost Hope Manor. Be warned. It's not too late to turn back. You may yet be spared. Dozens of hangman's nooses hung from the ceiling of the first room, dangling eerily above our heads. High up on the wall to our right, there was another bit that read, "Algernon Blackwood, the wretched soul who built this house, opened the gates to the spirit world. Tormented creatures trapped in limbo crawled out and attached themselves to this godforsaken place." Kind of dramatic, don't you think? Connie asked with a crooked smile. "Yeah, but I like it," I replied, trying to reach up to touch a noose but failing. "Gets me nostalgic for some older horror movies." "Sure." My boyfriend gave my hand an indulgent little squeeze. He didn't scare as easily as I did, but I had a feeling he rather enjoyed being the fearless type. He'd laugh his ass off every time I got spooked. The writings went on to reveal something or other about the various folks who'd lived in Lost Hope Manor over time, all of which had either been occultists, madmen, or murderers. It was getting pretty tedious, so both Conrad and I were relieved when it was finally our turn to walk the maze. Anticipation replaced boredom and frustration when our group was ushered into the first little hallway by a zombie in a messy park uniform. The door was slammed shut behind us. The corridor was dimly lit and narrow, forcing us all to uncomfortably squeeze together as we walked along. A fog machine, hidden somewhere out of sight, continuously poured smoke onto the floor. At the end of the tunnel, a pale blue light awaited us, giving the mist an otherworldly hue. It was pretty, in a skillfully disquieting way. Connie and I were walking in the front of the group, another couple and 3 teenagers trailing behind us, all whispering excitedly. No one dared to raise their voice, for it was deadly quiet. Just a few steps separated us from the glowing doorway when all of a sudden, a tall, dark silhouette appeared in its frame. Most of us, myself included, gasped sharply or stumbled back. The shadow vanished in a flash and we all started giggling. It was as if some kind of seal had been broken. The nervousness lingered, but we were ready for a scare. I hugged the plushie to my chest with one arm, latched onto Conrad with the other, and dashed forth towards the blue light. All hell broke loose the second we entered the first chamber of Lost Hope Manor. It was a small, cramped space with a couple tall, old wooden closets to both sides and a rocking chair in the corner. On it, with her back turned to us, sat a woman, clad in all white, stiff rags, rocking back and forth rapidly and with such force that the chair was producing pained creaking noises. In the background, a clock was ticking loudly, the sound of screams and maniacal laughter forming a nerve-wracking undercurrent that by itself would have been enough to set my heart racing. When we were halfway through the room, the woman in the chair abruptly turned around and let out an ear-piercing shriek, causing me to jump once more. Conrad let out an unbridled laugh which quickly morphed into a shout of surprise when the closet door behind him was flung open from the inside and an actor reached out to grab him by the shoulder. We darted out the door, squealing and cackling. The room we now found ourselves in was similarly small, and most of its space was taken up by the king-size bed right in its center. It was occupied by 2 skeletons. The pair looked authentic enough. Tufts of matted hair hung from their skulls and bits of rotten flesh and faded clothing clung to their bones. But the thing that actually creeped us out was the large bulge moving under the blanket from one side of the mattress to the other. The stifled giggles that came out from underneath turned into high-pitched chuckles when the formerly hidden person dropped onto the floor on all fours and darted over to me. I didn't catch more than a short glimpse of them before they snatched the plushie from my hands and hastily lumbered off, hunched over, whooping and cackling. At the time, I thought it was all in good fun. I figured they wanted me to give chase. I fully expected the actor to be waiting right behind the next door frame to throw the pug at me, giving me one last scare as they did. Without thinking twice, I hurried after the figure into the next room, but irritatingly, they didn't stop there. They threw me a quick glance over their shoulder, revealing a horrid grimace, a grin that actually seemed to split their face in half, wide, bloodshot eyes bulging out of way too deep sockets. Their contorted features were framed by messy red hair. Their visage sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't stop my pursuit. "Give that back!" I shouted, reaching out to grab them but not succeeding as they turned away just in time. "Cut it the fuck out!" "I mean it!" No response, just more giggles. I was starting to get pissed. This was too childish for my liking. I just wanted my plushie back and was hardly in the mood for playing catch with this admittedly athletic freak. Suddenly, they disappeared behind a curtain. I'd been so focused on the chase that I hadn't really taken note of the change in our surroundings up to that point, and I still couldn't be made to care. I sprinted straight after them, flinging the curtain aside and finding myself in a chamber that didn't quite look like it was part of the attraction. It was bigger, well-lit and full of boxes and props. I frowned in confusion. This was a dead end. There were no other doors in sight. The actor had apparently led me into a storage room. I was starting to get a really queasy feeling in my stomach, and not the pleasant kind from earlier. The performer themselves had come to a halt a few feet ahead of me and was now slowly turning around. They dropped the pug carelessly onto the floor, kicking it aside as they took a step towards me. I swallowed. My mind was running wild, trying to process what in the hell was going on. Something had changed. Something was wrong. The actor opened their mouth, revealing several rows of curved, needle-like teeth. I didn't jump, didn't cry out or squeal. I was too afraid to scream. This was a new, paralyzing type of fear, one that I had never felt before. I was seemingly rooted to the spot, suddenly unable to move. I wanted to run, but when I finally regained control over my body, all I could do was back off and stagger into a solid wall. I spun around, feeling tears come to my eyes when I realized that, impossible though it may have been, the curtains I'd entered through moments earlier were gone. Desperation gripped me, enmeshing my very soul. I wanted to pound against this wretched wall now, slam my fists into it until my bones would splinter, but I already knew it was hopeless. Where in God's name had this monster taken me? Where was Connie? Was he alright, or had the rest of the group been attacked as well? I could only pray they'd make it out alive. I most definitely wouldn't. Tears were rolling freely down my cheeks as all kinds of thoughts ran through my head. I would have been so happy if I'd gotten to stay alive. It could have all been so lovely. Life had been great up to that point. The redhead inched closer, tongue lolling out of its gaping maw. It was the most disgusting thing I'd ever seen. Strands of thick saliva were dripping from its lower lip. I had to put up a fight. Sure, this thing was going to end up devouring me. But I would render its experience a thoroughly unpleasant one. Leaning back against the wall, I whipped up my leg and kicked the creature right in the teeth. The tip of my boot connected splendidly with the upper front row of its teeth, causing several of them to crack and break. The monster let out a warped howl that nearly made my stomach turn. It raised a trembling hand to its face, almost as if in disbelief. Spotting another chance, I decided to take it. Summoning all my courage, I took a leap and landed right on the creature's ugly, hairy naked feet. Another cry of pain, the underlying fury unmistakable. It jumped me, knocking me to the group and instantly going for my throat, wrapping it short, stumpy fingers around it and squeezing. I tried to kick and thrash around and wriggle free, but to no avail. In one last act of defiance, I craned my neck and hurled a ball of spit at the grimace looming over me. It sailed right into its open mouth. Bullseye. I knew it was over. I had no strength left to fight. I lost control of my bladder, somehow finding it in me to feel ashamed when I felt my pants get wet. As my vision blurred, I let my gaze wander the room, searching for something else to look at during my final moments. My eyes fell on the plushie, lying lonely a bit off to the side. A warm feeling settled in my chest as I regarded it. At that moment, I only wished for Connie to be there to hold me. I couldn't have that, of course, but seeing the prize he'd won me instilled an almost similar sense of comfort within me. My lips stretched into a smile before everything turned black. And then, all of a sudden, the monster's grip around my throat disappeared. Air flooded my lungs as I reared up, greedily sucking it in. Despite the ringing in my ears and the sharp pain in my throat, consciousness returned to me astonishingly fast. The creature that had been squatting on my chest moments prior was cowering on the ground beside me. It was groaning and whimpering in fear, covering its head with both hands. Gasping and wheezing, I looked up. Standing above us was the man in the black duster. The axe in his hand was gleaming in the bright light of the ceiling lamp. He glared at the redhead with such hatred, such accusation, and such immense authority that even I found it intimidating. He took a swing with the axe, hitting the floor with a clunking noise. The blade came down mere inches away from the needle-toothed monster's head, having a couple strands of frizzy hair. The creature let out a high-pitched whine as it hastily scurried off, disappearing behind a stack of boxes where it curled up into something akin to the fetal position. The man didn't say a word. Instead, he took off his hat and pressed it to his chest before offering me a hand and helping me to my feet. I stared at him wordlessly. He stared back, not making a sound. I tilted my head to the right. He mirrored the movement. "What is that thing?" I pressed out, my voice sounding like I'd swallowed a fistful of gravel. I received no answer. "Who are you? How did you find me?" "Nothing." He held my gaze. He started patting his neck, then pointed at mine. "I think I'm fine," I croaked. "If that's what you mean." He nodded, then cocked his head and raised a questioning brow. Yes, I want to go. I gotta get out of here." I fell silent, reaching up to bring a hand to my burning throat. He nodded again, putting his hat back on and motioned for me to turn around. The wall had been replaced by the curtains I'd come in through. I looked back at the cowboy in utter confusion. "What is this place?" I asked weakly. The man merely shrugged and bent down to pick up the pug plush. He dusted it off before holding it out to me with a small, lopsided smile. I gratefully wrapped my arms around it. The stranger then placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, ushering me forth through the curtains. He led me through the remaining rooms of the haunted house, never lifting his palm from my back. I watched in a daze as actors sprang back to both sides as we passed through. The dense fog drifting at our feet drew back wherever he stepped, as though his boots sliced right through it. Everything moved by in a blur until we were finally back outside. The cool night air greeted me like an old friend. And there was Conrad, dear, sweet Connie, nervously pacing to and fro beside the exit. I wasted no time in throwing myself into his arms. He hugged me tightly, his warm breath caressing my ear and his heartbeat loud enough for me to hear through the sweater he pressed my face against. "Oh my God," he gasped when he let go of me, pulling back as if to look me over and check if I was still in one piece. "Are you all right?" Noticing the large wet spot on my pants, his face scrunched up with concern. "You must be freezing. Let's get you out of here. I'll buy you new pants in one of the stores, or you can have mine, if you want. I don't even care." His voice trailed off. "Oh God," he repeated. "It's okay," I rasped out. "I'm fine, honey." No, you're obviously not." "I'm so sorry. There was so much fog all of a sudden, I didn't see where you'd gone off to. I tried to look for you, but then some actors came along and just grabbed me and dragged me into the next room." He took a deep, trembling breath. "I guess I sort of knew something was wrong, but I figured you'd meet me by the exit. I hoped, but you weren't there, and I straight up panicked. None of the actors would listen to me when I asked for you, except for him." We both turned to look back at the black-clad cowboy only to find that he was gone. Connie swallowed audibly before adding, "He ran right in when I told him. He made me wait here in the meantime. I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to come with him at first, but he pushed me back. So I stayed behind." "What happened back there?" I shook my head, still nauseous and dazed. "I really couldn't say. I'll tell you when we get home, or on the way, but I just need to collect myself right now. That's fine, too, Connie said, giving me a peck on the cheek. I'm just glad you're okay. Let's go. I gave him a slow nod, allowing him to put his arm around me and carefully guide me down the street back to the park entrance. We had almost reached the gates when the sounds of sirens and a beating drum began to draw closer from behind. Is that the parade? I asked confusedly, turning back around. I think so, Connie replied, equally puzzled. Looks like they're marching out earlier than planned. We lingered on the sidewalk, watching as the ominous procession drew ever closer. I flinched when I laid eyes on their helmsman. Beating the bass drum, the man in the black duster led the trail of hobbling, growling, glowering creatures, more and more streaming out of the buildings and crowds to join them. His battle axe fastened by a belt on his back and his gaze steely and straightforward, my savior strode by us without paying us so much as a glance. I spotted the red-haired monster among the others, but I was grateful it didn't take notice of me. Its heavy footfalls aligned perfectly with the tact of the beating drum, just like the rest of the performers. They trotted along, obediently following their commander. My heart dropped into my stomach and I grabbed Connie's sleeve. At that moment, I understood. Not everything that had happened, but the dark cowboy's role in the ordeal. And that's probably the real reason he was my favorite monster at the theme park this year. I was invited to play the games in the woods. And what I saw out there will haunt me forever. When I was very young, my grandfather used to always tell me to stay out of the woods behind our house. Legend has it that there's something terrible in there. He'd say, pointing to the trees behind our home with his only arm, the other of which he'd told me he had lost in the war. And no one who goes in ever comes back the same. But I never took his warnings very seriously, given his age and hard life, writing them off as the ramblings of a senile and bitter old man. At least until a few years later, when, at the age of 10, I was told by my mother that my grandfather had passed and had left me a parting gift. It was a crumpled envelope with the word Bobby scribbled onto the back, sealed with more tape than an envelope needed sealing. Inside was a folded piece of paper, which, upon unfolding, I noticed my grandfather had sketched the layout of what looked like 3 games. Beside the first 2 games, he had written instructions for what looked like how to beat them. Don't go in the box. Don't run. Beside the third were a couple more notes. Don't lift it alone. This is as far as I made it, before I lost my arm. And at the very bottom of the page, Grandpa had addressed me directly. Bobby, if you receive an invitation to play the games in the woods, do not accept it. Run as far away as you can. But in the event you end up there anyway, may these instructions help you finish what I started. Games in the woods? I thought to myself. After all the warnings, and all the lectures, Grandpa was trying to protect me from games? I found the whole thing quite silly, and resolved to put it out of my mind. And so, that's exactly what I did, burying away both the loss of my grandfather, and the gift that he had left for me, for 4 long years. That is, until, at the age of 14, when I was a freshman in high school, I received a scroll on my doorstep, tied together with a thorny vine. After carefully unraveling it, I discovered an invite to the very games that my grandfather had warned me about, grotesquely handwritten in ink. Bobby, join us in the forest behind your house tonight, to compete in the games in the woods. Don't be late. The games will begin promptly at midnight. I laughed out loud and immediately tore up the scroll on the spot. But who could be the one pranking me? I wondered. Surely my mom wasn't in on it. Who could have known about the invitation that my grandfather referenced? Maybe my Uncle Frank? He's always been a jokester. Yes, it must be Uncle Frank. And on that note, I went about my day, and completely forgot about the scroll. That is, until later that night, when, while fast asleep, I suddenly felt myself torn from my bed, stuffed into what felt like a canvas satchel, and dragged out my window and, from the sound of it, what must have been through the woods behind my house. The whole time, I tried my best to kick and scream. This isn't funny, Uncle Frank. I know what you're up to. But Uncle Frank, or so I thought, was much too strong to break free from, and the next thing I knew, I found myself dropped into the middle of the forest, and my satchel ripped away. "Uncle Frank?" I called out, unable to see my surroundings in the dark. Until my eyes adjusted, and I looked up to find a hooded figure, wearing a tattered brown cloak and holding a burning torch that illuminated everything around him, save for what lay under his shadowy hood. "What the heck?" I thought to myself. "That's not Uncle Frank." The shrouded man said no words, and simply pointed to a footbridge, lit by torchlight, not far away, and gestured for me to cross it. Realizing now that this wasn't Uncle Frank's doing, and in turn, that the letter, and my grandfather's warning, must both be real, I began shaking in fear and, not knowing what else to do, obeyed the hooded figure's order. When I got to the other side, I found myself surrounded by what must have been 20 of the hooded man's kin, all holding torches, and encircling a glen in the forest, where the moon and the stars could now be seen in the night sky, and in the center of the glen, were 4 poor souls. Kids like me, who must have also received the invitation, or been dragged here against their will, or both. Kids, from my high school, that I recognized. There was Brad Ashworth, our class valedictorian, in a sweater vest, khakis, and boots, clearly prepared for the occasion. Caitlin Sullivan, whom many kids called a nerd, geek, dweeb, and weirdo, but whom I found to be perfectly normal, wearing a pair of overalls and round, wire-frame glasses. Colin Richardson, in a running suit, a jock, known for excelling at least 3 sports, football, track, and basketball. And none other than Milton Dugan, the biggest bully in school, best known for using his sheer size to jam freshmen into lockers, wearing a pair of polka dot pajamas. "Shut up, loser," he called out to me, noticing the smile on my face when I saw what he was wearing. "What do you think they are?" Colin asked me, pointing to the hooded figures. "I have no idea. But I don't think they're friendly," I replied. Until Caitlin chimed in, "They're druids, idiots. Whatever they are, I'm not scared of them," Brad added. That's when it hit me. Who would bring 5 high school students out into the middle of the woods to teach them a lesson? Well, teachers, of course. That must be it. Teachers. Yes, it's teachers under those hoods. But before I could continue to dwell on my epiphany, we were all suddenly interrupted by the sound of a loud howl emanating from the forest. And then, an old man with a white beard came hobbling out of the woods, walking stick in one hand, and an object that I couldn't identify in his other. It was only when he reached the center of the glen, and stopped just a few feet away from us, that I noticed he was missing something. The reflection of light in his eyes. And upon further observation, it became apparent that he had no eyes at all. "What the?" I thought to myself, before gasping, as the old man began to speak. "Invited ones. You stand before me tonight, under the light of the moon, with a great challenge before you. A challenge that only comes around every 75 years. Each of you were handpicked to play these games tonight, for each of you represent a unique virtue. 5 virtues put to the same test, to see which will overcome all others. The winner will be awarded the greatest prize of all, while the losers will pay a heavy price." The other 4 kids and I turned to each other with looks of confusion, then turned back to the old man, who continued. "But before we begin, which of you knows for a fact that you are the best player among us? Which of you is so brave, so courageous, so sure of your abilities, that you'll volunteer to step into the box?" he asked, pointing to an area of the glen that had been covered in darkness, but until the druids lit it with torchlight. It was a wooden box, about the size of a telephone booth, completely enclosed with what appeared to be a door on one side and a metal latch to open it. The box. I thought to myself, remembering my grandfather's letter, outlining 3 games, and assuming the first of which was this one. Here is the story too. Don't go in the box. Easy enough, I mused, looking over at the other kids, waiting for one of them to heed the call instead, until... It's me. I'm the smartest, and the most talented one here. I'll do it, Brad called out, raising his hand, before turning back to us, cowards. Very well, the old man replied, walking over to the box, opening the door, and gesturing for him to enter. And so he did. Oh no! I thought to myself, as all of us kids cringed in anticipation of something unspeakable happening inside. But after a minute, the old man simply walked back over to the door, opened it, and let Brad out. He came proudly walking out of it, chest in the air, with a smug smile on his face, and belted out the words. "See? Nothing to fear, fraidy cats." Despite his obnoxious comment, we all let out a sigh of relief. Until suddenly, a few of the druids grabbed Brad by the arms, and pinned him to the box. "What's going on? What are you doing?" Our valedictorian cried out, unsure of what exactly was happening. The hooded men proceeded to pry open his jaws with their hands, as the old man hobbled over to him, revealing the object in his hand, a sharp, silver sword. But before any of us could react, the old druid had already reached into Brad's mouth, cut off his tongue, and held it up for all to see. Brad began crying and wailing, blood spraying from his mouth, as the druids let him go and he fell to the ground, arms flailing in pain. Meanwhile, the rest of us kids just stood there, wide-eyed in fear, unable to comprehend what we had just seen. That was game one. The old man called out to us. "Let it be a lesson, that your greatest strengths can also be your greatest weaknesses. In this case, confidence begets arrogance. Now, take him away." Upon his command, 2 druids ran over to Brad, who was now passed out, picked him up, and carried him away into the woods. "Let's move on to game 2, shall we?" The eyeless old man continued, leading us, and the other druids, out of the glen, into the forest, down a torchlit path, and to a massive field, illuminated by the moonlight. He then took his staff, stuck it into the ground, and carved a long line in the dirt. "Will the remaining players please stand behind the line?" Still in shock from what had just happened, we all obeyed his command, lining up before the line in the dirt, which separated us from the football field-sized lawn. "Are you gonna hurt one of us again?" Milton called out, puffing out his chest. "'Cause I'm not afraid of you guys, and I'm fully capable of defending myself." The old man ignored his rant, and continued on with his own. "The rules of the second game are simple. When I say go, you're to run with the wolves." "Wolves?" Caitlin whispered to me, trying to understand he meant. Just then, a group of druids emerged from the forest, leading 4 ravenous wolves on leashes to the field behind us, each of them drooling at the mouth while howling and growling at us maniacally. Caitlin and I shared a brief look of horror, before the eyeless man stepped aside and called out, "Go!" Colin was the first one to sprint off into the field, followed by Caitlin, and then, what would have been me, but when I began to dart away, something jutted out in front of my legs and tripped me to the ground. Confused by what had happened, I looked up from the dirt to see Milton hopping over me. "Sucker!" As I realized that it must have been he who had tripped me, and saw the druids unleash the 4 wolves. I hopped up to my feet and attempted to run again, but before they hit the ground, the wolves had already caught up to me. In that moment, I closed my eyes and braced for the worst, but when I opened them again, I saw that they had run right past me, seemingly in pursuit of the others up ahead. But as I continued to watch the wolves run away, I noticed that they soon passed Milton too, and then Caitlin, finally making their way to Colin, who was running so fast that he disappeared into whatever lay beyond the field. And then, the feral dogs stopped running, just before the end of the field, and began howling and growling again, and they looked down at something below them. Eventually catching up with the others and making my way to the end of the field, Caitlin, Milton, and myself finally saw what had happened to Colin. There, at the end of the field, was a great pit, and at the bottom was the star athlete himself, writhing in pain and begging for our help. "Help me!" Colin called out, clenching his legs, which must have broken from the fall. "Does anyone have a rope or anything we can lower down to him?" Caitlin asked. But the druids had just arrived, and were already lowering one down to Colin. And by the time they pulled him up, still screaming out in pain, the old eyeless druid had arrived, ready to greet him. "Why would you put a pit at the end of the race?" Colin screamed, as he lay helpless on the ground. You said to run from the wolves. I said to run with the wolves, not from them. They mean no harm, just look at your friends here. But you got ahead of yourself. And for that, there is a price. The old man warned. Price? I already broke my legs. Colin replied. Well now, we take them. The eyeless man said ominously, before the druid surrounded Colin and held him down, as another approached him holding a giant scythe, its blade glimmering in the moonlight. Wait. No. He cried out. But it was too late. In an instant, one of his legs was gone. Severed from his body by the swinging scythe, as blood sprayed everywhere, and Colin screamed in agony. A second later, I saw Caitlin remove her glasses and wipe the blood from them, before putting them back on and continuing to watch on silently in horror. What is wrong with you guys? Milton called out, clenching his fists and pacing around in a threatening fashion. For a moment, I thought about cursing out Milton for tripping me, but then I realized he had actually saved me. And that's when I remembered my grandfather's second clue. Don't run. He was right again. Take him away. The old man said for a second time, as a group of druids walked over and proceeded to carry Colin off into the woods, before turning to Milton, Caitlin, and myself. And now for game 3. He then led us back into the forest, and down a rocky path that hugged a winding stream. At the end of the path, we came to a clearing between the trees, where we saw 2 giant boulders, each nearly the size of a person, placed side by side on the ground. For this game, you have an option. Lift a boulder yourself, or pick a teammate to help you lift it. The person or team who holds it the longest, wins. And the one who's first to drop it, loses. Understand? Milton, Caitlin, and I all looked at each other for a moment, as we weighed the options. But suddenly, I remembered my grandfather's third instruction. Don't lift it alone. And before Milton could utter a word, I ran over to Caitlin. Caitlin and I will be a team, I declared, as she smiled, and put her arm around my shoulder. But what about me? Milton asked, offended by being the odd man out, before correcting himself. Actually, you know what? Fine. I'm stronger than both of you combined anyway. This will be your own undoing, dorks. I'll compete by myself. Very well, the old man called out, as he stood between the 2 stones. When I say go, lift the boulders up off the ground, for as long as you can. Caitlin and I crouched down and gripped the boulder from below, then looked at each other. We got this, I assured her with a smile. We got this, she replied, smiling back. Meanwhile, Milton was scrambling to grasp onto his boulder, and began begging for more time. Just a second, I swear. This boulder's heavier on one side and it's just ash. But before he could continue, the old man raised his staff and called out, "Go," at the top of his lungs. Caitlin and I carefully and calmly lifted our boulder, and despite its heavy weight, strained ourselves to keep it elevated above the ground. But Milton was not as lucky. From the very beginning, he was doomed, as he still hadn't secured his grip on the rock when the old man yelled go, and bumbled when he lifted it up, catching it in hands, but in a position that looked much too uncomfortable for him to sustain. And as the stone slowly began to slip out of his arms, Milton looked over at Caitlin and I with a sour face and mumbled, "You screwed me, losers. Maybe if you weren't such a dick, Milton, someone might have chosen you," I replied, in an attempt to drive home the reason why he had lost. Milton tried to think of a clever retort, "You know what, Bobby Dash," but before he could finish his sentence, it was too late. The stone had fallen to the ground. He stopped what he was saying and looked down at it, a look of fear washing over his face. And as the druids began to surround him, rather than threaten them like he had in the past, Milton began to cry. "Please don't hurt me. Please, I'll do anything." But it was too late. The druids dragged Milton to the stump of a tree and laid his arm down upon it, as another swung an axe high above his head, and brought it slicing down through Milton's arm, leaving him with a stump of his own. As he saw the blood pouring out of his appendage, Milton began to scream, until his eyes rolled into the back of his head and he eventually passed out. And for a third time, the eyeless old man called out, "Take him away." Now, only Caitlin and I remained. Together we stood there in silence, arms around each other, as Milton's limp body was carried off into the woods. Which brings us to Game 4, the old druid began, perhaps the simplest of all. For this game is decided by you and you alone. When I say go, you'll have 1 minute to come to a decision on who will be the winner, and who will be the loser. Caitlin replied, "Wait dash." But before she could continue, the old man interrupted her, commencing the final game, "Go." Caitlin and I huddled together in the woods, as the old man and the druids encircled us, waiting for us to come to a consensus. "Wait, what do we do?" Caitlin whispered. "I don't know." I whispered back. "Should we choose both of us as the winners?" "No, we'd be breaking the rules." He specified a winner and a loser. "They'll punish us both. We need to choose one. But that means one of us will suffer the same fate as the others. I don't know if we have any other choice." "Then how should we decide?" "I don't know." "Wait," Caitlin said, as she reached into the pocket of her overalls and removed a coin. "If you're okay with it. A coin toss would be fair. Totally up to chance." "It would be fair." "Let's do it. But quick," I replied, knowing our minute would soon end. "Then you choose. Heads or tails?" She offered up. "Okay. Heads," I replied quickly. And like that, Caitlin held out her fist. Dropped the coin. Towards the forest floor below. Time suddenly slowing. As it descended towards the ground. Spinning. And spinning. And spinning. Until... thud. We both crouched down and saw the result that would seal our fate forever. Heads. I had one. Caitlin looked up at me, her eyes wide, and her mouth agape, as tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "It's okay," she whispered back. And then, the old man spoke. "Your time is up. What is your decision? Who is the winner, and who is the loser?" Both Caitlin and my heads hung low, as she began to speak. "I'm the dash. Winner," I interrupted, as she looked at me, completely surprised by what I had said. "She's the winner, and I'm the loser." "But Bobby Dash," she whispered. "Save yourself. Don't worry about me," I insisted, whispering back to her, as the old man approached us. "Very well," he said, holding his wrinkled hand out to Caitlin, who accepted it in hers. And so, he escorted her away, off into the woods, hobbling on his wooden staff, until they disappeared into the night. And as for me, I was left there in the dark, surrounded by a dozen druids, who slowly closed in on me. I didn't know what to do, so I, accepting my fate, simply closed my eyes and braced for the worst. But similar to what had come of the impending doom of the howling wolves, nothing happened. I opened my eyes, to find one of the druids standing before me. "Congratulations," he said, in an ominous voice, "on winning the games." "What?" I asked, confused how that could be possible. "I don't understand." "I voted for Caitlin to be the winner." "Yes, you did," he replied, "but humility is the virtue that always wins the games. Your selfless act, sacrificing your own life for that of another's, is why you won." "And what do I win?" I asked, not knowing what else to say. Just as the keeper of the games had stated, the greatest prize of all. He said, "Life." "And what about Caitlin? What will become of her?" "That is still yet to be decided. But you will find out soon enough." Any sort of relief that I had felt immediately disappeared, and my heart sank, as I realized that by volunteering my own life to save Caitlin's, I may have actually cost her hers. "Wait," I called out, "let me take her place. Please." But before I could continue, I felt the druid shove a giant canvas satchel over me, just as they'd done earlier that night, before whisking me away into the forest. They must have knocked me out after that, because when I came to, I found myself back in my bedroom, lying face first on the cold, wooden floor. The next day at school, I raced to Caitlin's locker, and then her homeroom, desperately hoping to see her face, hoping to put my mind at ease. But she never showed up. That day, or ever again. And as for Brad, Colin, and Milton, their claims about how they lost their respective body parts, despite being substantiated by me, were all written off by police, parents, and teachers alike as foolish accidents, when no such games were ever found in the woods. Years later, as my wife and I discuss having a child, I find myself wondering if I'll ever have a grandchild of my own. If they, too, will be invited to play the games in the woods the next time the Druids come around. And if Caitlin will be one of them. Story 3. Haunted Couch? This is a true story. I don't expect you to believe, but it is absolutely true. I'm a hard atheist, and I don't believe in anything supernatural. But I still don't know how to explain these events. Another thing to note is that I didn't suspect anything supernatural at the time. It was only about a year later that I was able to make the connections. The story ties together in a very sort of subtle way, but I think it'll be fairly obvious in my retelling of the events. It wasn't obvious at the time though. This took place 2 years ago. I had started my 3rd year of college in Manhattan. My roommate and I just rented a nice little apartment in East Village, and it was a great find: spacious living room, bathroom, and 2 bedrooms, ideal for 2 college students. For those of you who know the area, I was around 12th and Avenue A. To give a quick layout of the place, there are 4 rooms. The living room, which also had a kitchen sink, fridge, stovetop, and microwave, was connected to the front door. This room was also connected to the 3 other rooms: my bedroom, Vince's bedroom, and a bathroom. The living room is where all the spookiness happened. In the hectic 2 weeks in which my roommate and I were furnishing/cleaning up the apartment, we purchased a couch off of Craigslist for the low price of $35. Under the condition that we pick it up and transport it ourselves. It was a nice 2-person couch, maybe a little shabby looking but very comfortable. Everyone gasps in surprise the way you just sink into it. The young woman said that her mother had given it to her, but she was upgrading to a bigger couch and had no room for it. We threw it in our living room, behind a small coffee table. Minor arguments started occurring about 2 weeks into the school year. And it primarily concerned one thing. We would sometimes wake up and the living room light would be switched on. My roommate is a hardcore advocate of conserving electricity, and the first few times he chided me gently. He told me that I must have gotten up in the night and forgotten to turn them off. I thought it was probably him who did it, but I let it pass. This phenomenon would continue to happen. Sometimes twice a week we would wake up in the morning and find the living room light on. My roommate was infuriated when I suggested that perhaps he left the light on. I then suggested that maybe there was something funky going on in the wiring, but the building super, who is also an electrician, took a look and said everything seemed fine. I then grew worried. I had never lived with Vince before. I was certain that he must have some sort of sleeping disorder that either caused him to sleepwalk or to get up in the middle of the night and forget about it the next morning. My suspicions were vindicated one night when I could hear footsteps outside my door. They walked across the living room to the front door. I could hear the front door open and then close. I was having strange dreams. I have to pause here to explain that I've always, my whole life, had strange, recurring, and sometimes obviously symbolic dreams. For just one example, when my life is getting a little hectic, I dream that I'm driving a car but losing control and crashing into things. Very cliché. Anyways, I started having the following dream a few times a week. I'd be in a long hallway, and it's very dark, covered in shadows. Although I don't notice this during the dream, I only realized it after. There are mock paintings on the wall, but I can never really remember what they are. I think they were something scenic. The main characteristic of the dream is a strange feeling I have. I want to sit down. My legs and feet are overwhelmingly exhausted, and I just have to sit down. It almost feels like a force of gravity is pulling me. I look at the ground and prepare to sit down, but I then notice that the ground is wet, covered in a thin layer of murky water. And that's the dream. I must be working too hard in school or something. The following month, 3 things happened that started to mystify me. I'm a skeptic, but I love a good spook, and I used to joke about these 3 things with my friends. I wove the mysterious living room light into the tale as well. By this time, Vince and I had accepted it to be an electricity malfunction. Here are the 3 things. 1. I was using the toilet one day, when I heard my roommate call out, "Where are you?" It sounded distant. In retrospect, I'm not even sure if it sounded like him. But at the time my mind instantly registered it to be my roommate, and I called back, "Hold on, I'm taking a shit." When I left the bathroom, nobody was in the apartment. I called Vince. He told me he had been playing tennis uptown for the past few hours. 2. One day I came home from school, and the living room sink was turned on. The water was overflowing onto the floor, and my audio speakers were fucking ruined. Annoying. 3. This one isn't a single event, but a recurring one. Remember the sound of the footsteps in the living room I mentioned? It ended with the front door opening and closing? Well, I started hearing these sounds on a weekly basis. The footsteps never sounded quite the same. Sometimes they moved sort of questioningly, sometimes confidently. Sometimes they sort of circled around a few times. Sometimes there even seemed to be 2 people. Once I think the footsteps even ran. But it always ended with the front door opening and closing. Like I said, I had just assumed that my roommate was walking in his sleep, when something suddenly struck me. The door that opened and closed sounded nothing like our front door. It was completely different. The door I heard at night sounded large, heavy, and kind of old, absolutely nothing like our door. Okay, so this must have all been a little confusing, so let me lay out all the evidence. 3 recurring things. 1. I have the hallway dream. 2. I hear footsteps in the door at night. 3. The living room light is turned on in the morning. 2 isolated incidents. 1. The tap was left on. 2. I heard someone calling to me when I was on the toilet. Then something else happened. It was finals week. My roommate had already left for home, winter break, and I was living in the apartment by myself for a few days. I had just gotten back from a recording technology exam, and I crashed onto the living room couch. It was about 11 a.m., and I hadn't slept a wink the night before, as I was studying. I instantly fell into a deep sleep, and throughout the entire following dream I had a strange, almost pleasant, floating sensation. I was in the hallway again. The paintings were on the walls, and the ground might have been wet, but I didn't notice it this time. This is because I didn't feel any urge to sit down this time. Everything was dark. Yes, I could actually note that everything was dark during the dream this time. In fact, this time it actually felt like I was in control of my actions. In the other dreams everything seemed premeditated and predictable, like I was just a puppet being guided by strings. This time I was very much there, and very much lucid. I turned around, but there was a dead end behind me. Just an empty wall. The only way to move was forward, down this narrow hall. I didn't really want to move down this hall, but I felt like I had no choice. I sort of stood there contemplating. In the distance, I saw a figure moving forward ahead of me. I could hear footsteps as well. I felt sort of relieved. Good, someone else is here, and this person is moving down the hallway first. I guess I'm supposed to follow suit. I moved forward, into the darkness. I heard the person ahead of me open and close a door, and eventually I reached this door myself. It was a very old-fashioned door, with a wooden knob. With some difficulty I turned the knob. It was a little bit stiff, and looked into the room ahead. This room was pitch black. I mean, the last room was only dark and shadowed. In here, I couldn't see 2 goddamn feet ahead of me. The air was a little cold and damp. I had the feeling that it was a very big room, but of course I had no way of knowing. It felt like there was something very large in there, but once again, there was no way of knowing. Where was the person I followed in? I called out, "Where are you?" The only response is a slight echo. It was a big room. I was suddenly gripped by fear. I didn't want to move in, but I didn't have a choice, did I? I decided that there was no way in hell I was moving forward. So I gripped the wall to the right of me, and I inched to my right, guiding myself along the wall. I was surprised that the wall felt like any ordinary, indoor wall. I expected it to be stone or industrial, given the cold, damp air in the room. I inched further and further into the room, and eventually I came up to a light switch. Goody! My finger was half an inch from the switch when suddenly, an elderly hand shot out from the darkness and snatched my wrist. I screamed and awoke with a start. I was sitting on my living room couch, and the microwave clock read 4 a.m. I panted for air. I could still physically feel where the cold hand had clamped my wrist. It felt so real. But dreams are dreams, and I had returned to reality. I sighed. I was back in familiar territory. Everything seemed normal. In fact, I guess the only thing that wasn't normal is that the living room light was switched on.